There are many familiar names and events we think of when talking about the civil rights movement, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, the Greensboro Sit-In, and more. But there are many other lesser-known figures of the civil rights movement who have not been emphasized in our historical memory of this important time period, despite making critical advancements in the campaign for the civil rights. So let's look into who these figures are and why they are not remembered in the official narrative of this period. One very important female campaigner from North Carolina was Ella Baker, who is also known as the mother of the civil rights movement. She spent nearly 50 years working to extend civil rights by encouraging Black citizens to stand up for their rights, building coalitions, and petitioning to end school segregation. Further, she was a part of the three most important civil rights groups at the time, being the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Despite her extensive work, she personally never sought the spotlight or recognition for her contributions, which has contributed to her being less remembered today. Another female activist who made important achievements at the time was Daisy Bates. She was the president of the Arkansas NAACP and was key to integrating the schools in Little Rock, going so far as to walking the 9 colored students to school every day who were chosen to first begin the integration process. She became friends with MLK, was a member of several executive committees, and was even on Lyndon B. Johnson's administration. One more woman of the civil rights movement who is less remembered is Diane Nash. She executed the first successful civil rights campaign to integrate lunch counters in Nashville, helped the Freedom Riders who desegregated interstate travel, co-founded the SNCC, and co-initiated the Alabama Voting Rights Project.
Eartha Kitt was an actress and singer from the South that at the age of 8 was sent from the South to Harlem to escape prejudice. From Harlem, she rose to fame with her unique persona, and through this fame was invited to the White House, in which the video ahead speaks about.
Success of freeing our neighborhoods from hoodlums and fear depends upon the cooperation of all our citizens.
The women of America can increase the safety of our streets, control the sale of firearms and these mail-order murders, restore respect for our law enforcement officers.
Mahalia Jackson is an important woman when it comes to the spread of the civil rights movement. She was brought up in a very religious atmosphere and was forced to confine her vocal abilities to the church. Because of this, she became quite good at singing old hymns and gospel songs. Eventually, she began touring with gospel choirs across the country and quickly became well known. Once she had her wide public platform, she began singing songs about the civil rights movement and used that platform to further the cause.
Andrew Young was a minister, representative, and ambassador that was also involved in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He began as a minister, then joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and continued and heightened his activism through this. With his new influence, he ran for the House of Representatives and lost for the first time. He then won the next two, and from this position, he was nominated to be an ambassador for the U.S. He was then sworn in and did this job for 13 years until he had to resign for having an unauthorized meeting.
And men and women of color presented their check at the Bank of Justice. It came back marked insufficient funds. But then he said he knew that wasn't the end. But 50 years later, we're still here trying to cash that bad check. 50 years later, we're still dealing with all kinds of problems. And so we're not here to claim any victory. We're here to simply say that the struggle continues.
Bayard Rustin was the man who organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Everyone involved in the march knew that it was his genius behind the protest, yet he never found his way into the spotlight of the civil rights movement. This was in part because of his socialist political views, and the other leaders of the civil rights movement were concerned about this and considered his views a liability. Rustin's lack of public identity in the civil rights movement also had to do with the fact that, at the time, he was a closeted gay man. Later in his life, however, he felt that he was able to come out and became a major advocate for gay rights. Ralph Abernathy, another integral member of the civil rights movement, was a Baptist pastor and one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s most trusted associates. He helped organize the Montgomery bus boycott, which is considered to be one of the first major protests of the civil rights movement. In addition to this, he also co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. While Abernathy is obviously an incredibly important figure when it comes to the civil rights movement, he is not recognized as much as he should be in its narrative, due to the fact that he lived in Dr. King's shadow, both in the civil rights movement and in the church. The garbage workers' strike was a protest against the unfair and unclean working environment that Memphis garbage workers were subjected to. Reverend James Morris Lawson Jr., pastor of Centenary Methodist Church in Memphis, was able to organize a worker strike and called Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to see if he would be interested in helping. King immediately agreed to help and traveled to Memphis. King's presence improved morale among the workers, and the strike continued successfully until a couple men veered off from the main group and smashed in the windows of some local shops. From there on out, the nonviolent protest descended into a riot, complete with the National Guard, armed tanks, and reinvigorating speeches supplied by Dr. King. The day after his "I Have Seen the Mountaintop" speech, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed.
The Mule Train and Resurrection City were a part of the Poor People's Campaign started by Martin Luther King Jr. The Mule Train was inspired by Robert Kennedy telling them to bring the poor people to Washington when he was told about this problem. MLK planned the trip to start in the poorest city, Marks, Mississippi, and then moved to Washington, D.C. They covered the wagons with messages and headed on. This campaign was to bring attention to how the people were living. It brought a lot of attention from sheriffs and people who didn't like it, but it continued. They then reached Washington and set up a town, Resurrection City. This town had the goal to get noticed, but it was mostly forgotten. It was neglected by the government, who were focused on the Vietnam War, and the poor also had very little visibility and voice, and had recently lost MLK's large influence and voice on the world. Bayard Rustin led this, but he was less impactful than MLK was.